On the sunny and warm afternoon of May 16, 1890, a heavily armed U.S. warship slipped into a little harbor and was ready for a fight. The soldiers on board got their final orders from their captain, loaded their weapons, and prepared themselves mentally to storm the beach. They expected fierce resistance when they landed. Their mission, to dislodge an evil tyrant from power. Under the rule of this tyrant, citizens lived in fear from his random acts of violence. He inflicted retribution on anyone who challenged him, and even those who did not. President Benjamin Harrison would later stand in front of Congress to defend the military intervention, saying it was, quote, justified in the interest of the nation. But this military intervention did not take place on some foreign distant shore. Our story takes place in Cedar Key, Florida, and the name of this tyrant? It's the town's mayor, William B. Cottrell, and he went by Billy. And Billy was a bully, and he and his gang of friends ruled Cedar Key through sheer terror alone. You see, during this time in Cedar Keys, economic difficulties and rising taxes had caused the once prosperous town's population to dwindle to less than 2,100. Cedar Key's isolated location, accessible by just one narrow road and a single railway, made it an ideal place to control. And control is exactly what William B. Cottrell intended to do. Elected in 1889 with 101 unanimous votes, Cottrell quickly showed himself to be no ordinary mayor, as he was also the inspector of customs, a powerful role in a town dependent on maritime commerce. At 33, this was Billy's first real job, and fittingly, he showed total ineptitude as mayor. He disappeared frequently and secretly, once being absent for over a month. His absence was never missed, but yet despite his total lack of leadership, it did not, however, prevent his re-election. But this time, however, he only received 67 out of the possible 124 votes, with the remainder going to his opponent, Samuel G. Reddick. With this somewhat narrow margin, Billy began to get paranoid that he was losing control over his town. These votes, however, were not secret, and following the election, his acts of violent retribution increased. Cottrell received additional support in his activities when his own henchmen buddies were hired onto the Cedar Keys police force. The town marshal, J.R. Mitchell, followed Cottrell around supposedly only out of fear of being shot. This unruly band Cottrell had assembled never recognized personal privacy or property. They behaved as if they owned the town. During drunken episodes for entertainment, they would turn townspeople out of their own homes and into the streets, making them dance at gunpoint. Death threats also prevented a majority of the citizens from reporting Cottrell's actions to outside authorities. Billy was rumored to have killed from at least 5 to 10 people. His 3 brothers joined in the campaign of terror by declaring that they would hunt down and kill anyone causing harm to their little brother Billy. Cottrell's penchant for holding long grudges was well known, and most of Cedar Key's residents simply would not try to cross his eyesight. Many of his grudges were simply unexplainable, especially the one against telegrapher A.M. Wraith, who the mayor forced a black man at gunpoint to beat mercilessly on a town street. Cottrell also tried to kill a railway agent and once used a knife to wound another man over just some perceived insult. In another account of his erratic behavior, Billy Cottrell was racing his family's boat, the Nanny, in Tampa Bay, when another boat passed him and began to pull away. Enraged with anger, Billy went below deck for his shotgun to shoot the other captain. The crewmates on board, who were his friends, had to physically take control of him and calm him down to keep him from shooting at the other captain. And Billy was also known to carry a gun at all times, using it even to intimidate shopkeepers, citizens, and even his own family. He killed his sister's husband in a dispute and would later chastise her relentlessly for being poor. On one occasion, while dining with his wife Carolina at the Schlemmer Schlemmer house, he tried to start an argument with the local lighthouse keeper. Cottrell was saying disparaging words about the lighthouse keeper to another man in the room. Knowing Cottrell's temperament, the keeper did not acknowledge the insults and kept silent. This silent rebuff, however, infuriated Cottrell, who reached for his revolver. Noticing the firearm, the keeper made his escape through the dining room and up the hotel's back stairway. In pursuit, Cottrell tripped and fell and fired a shot that passed between the keeper's arm and torso, ripping a hole in the wall. With the keeper now gone, Cottrell returned to his table and calmly finished his meal as if nothing had happened. The Schlemmer house, however, was not the only building dotted with Cottrell's pistol shot. Nearly all of the buildings on the main street displayed bullet holes from his drunken tantrums. He held townspeople at gunpoint, and he insulted women and even struck children while they were still being carried in the arms of their mother. And Cottrell's acts of violence killed any hope of economic recovery. He even shot at the few businessmen willing to make the trip to Cedar Key. He and his street rule dissuaded citizens from shopping. His own brother, Eugene and James, mentioned earlier, had a mercantile business that was forced to close for lack of customers, even though Billy Cottrell coerced people to shop there. Newspaper accounts report that business in the town was, quote, practically dead. Long lines of stores stand closed, one firm after another having sold out. The business owners were either afraid to dwell in such a lawless place or gave up in despair at the sign of general decline. And you might wonder how Billy could get away with all this trouble. You see, Billy was the product of political nepotism. Cottrell's father, Colonel James L.F. Cottrell, was a former 5-term state senator and still exercised great political influence. And in a particularly slick move, at the former Senator Cottrell's urging, Governor Francis P. Fleming had a special bill enacted that placed a time limitation on indictments because the Levy County grand jury had issued 18 indictments against his son, Billy, none of which were ever served. By the time President Harrison decided to intervene, big trouble had been brewing in Little Cedar Key for well over a year. The first alert the president received came from a local woman by the name of Mrs. Rose Bell. In her letter, dated August 4th, 1889, she called for an investigation into the outrageous conduct being perpetrated by the, quote, habitual drunkard Cottrell. She described the mayor as bullying locals and forcing a black man to parade through the town in costume. She went on to say that the good Christian men on the town were too scared to put up a fight to stop his outrages. She ended her letter by saying, quote, she had no son or husband for him to shoot. I exposed his character. President Harrison would later comment that it was a, quote, very grim commentary upon the condition of social order at Cedar Key that only a woman had the courage to file charges against Cottrell. President Harrison then appointed Jaden Harvey Pinkerton as collector of port, and it brought a new obstacle to the mayor's reign of terror in Cedar Key. Pinkerton had been sent there and had been named the new customs collector of the port with oversight of revenue generation and maritime law. It was a fairly coveted and influential position in the small town of Cedar Key. It was said that immediately when he got there, he ran up against Cottrell and had problems right from the beginning. Cottrell, as inspector of customs, was now outranked by the collector of the port job held by Pinkerton. Cottrell had expected to be automatically slotted to the more senior post before Pinkerton's arrival. It was said that, quote, little did J. Harvey Pinkerton know the quagmire he was about to be ensconced in. Cottrell reasoned that political favoritism had caused his dismissal. His father and brother had held custom inspector positions under the former collector of the port, McDaniels. Republican President Harrison, however, changed many politically appointed posts. Cottrell, a Democrat, felt he should have kept his job regardless of who was in the White House. The following June, Billy received yet another slap to the face when J. Harvey Pinkerton appointed his 27-year-old son, F.H. Pinkerton, for the custom inspector's post and then dismissed Cottrell from the position for allegations of misconduct. But instead of an outright firing, Billy Cottrell was allowed to resign, probably to allow him and his family to save face. Following his removal, Cottrell approached the elder J.H. Pinkerton in town one evening, asking if he might retrieve his personal belongings from the customs house. According to Pinkerton's dispatch to the Treasury Department, when he refused to open the customs house after hours, Cottrell ordered the town marshal to shoot the goddamn Republican son of a bitch. Pinkerton then goes on to say that he called me all the vile names he could think of and hollered in an angry voice and said, quote, "I will make it a hell for you and your set as long as you stay in Cedar Keys," and many other vile things equally bad, all the time using the most profane threats and vile epithets. Cottrell was furious and warned Pinkerton not to show himself on the streets of Cedar Key or Cottrell would shoot him dead with his shotgun. Pinkerton knew the threat was serious and stayed home, becoming a virtual prisoner in his house. Frustrated at Pinkerton's refusal to come out of the custom house, Cottrell tried to force a black man to go into the customs house and drag Pinkerton out into the street. The man refused and for his bravery received a savage beating from Cottrell. Later that evening, Pinkerton slipped out and sent a telegram to the Treasury Department outlining his difficulties and pleading for help. And with him threatening to kill Pinkerton, things were different. Cottrell now found himself outside the influence of his father and friends. At Pinkerton's request, the Revenue Cutter Service sent its ship, the McLean, captained by Thomas S. Smith, to intervene. Treasury Secretary William Wyndon conferred with the new Chief of Revenue Cutter Service, Captain Leonard G. Shepard, who sent telegrams directing the McLean to Cedar Key. And unsure of its exact location, Captain Shepard sent telegrams to every port the McLean may stop at along its cruising ground. The cutter arrived in Tampa on May 14th, and while on shore, Lieutenants Carden and Orrin D. Myrick learned of the incident unfolding at Cedar Key through the local Tampa press. Realizing the emergency, the two hurriedly made the 9-mile trek back to the McLean, where she was preparing to continue steaming to her normal station at Edgemont Key. Smith received the news from the officers, but did not steam immediately for Cedar Key and waited till the next morning so he could do an all-daylight trip. In the meantime, the officers and crew became fully aware of the emergency and Cottrell's nature, so they spent the time on shore. Once in Cedar Key, Captain Smith finally received his official orders from Washington: capture or kill William Cottrell. The captain, however, decided to wait until the next morning to begin his search for Cottrell. Although short-handed at the time, an armed landing party went ashore and returned at about 12 noon without finding Cottrell or any of his followers. A second sweep at around 4 p.m. of Way Key and of Cottrell's house again yielded nothing. The third search party of the day left the cutter at about 8:30 for a night search, and another party went to search Oceanic Key, an island opposite of the town. Backed by the might of the McLean, Smith's crew and the arrival of additional marshals launched more searches for the mare. The men scoured homes, businesses, and even the swampy waters around Cedar Key, but Cottrell eluded capture. At Pinkerton's request, the cutter remained nearby to calm fears that Cottrell would reappear in town. Despite more than a year of abuse by the Mayor Cottrell, the appearance of a federal cutter on their shores was not welcomed by all. Just a little more than 25 years after Union troops had left Cedar Key, a vein of hostility still ran through the small town. Quote, "The people here have lived so long in an unreconstructed condition that the appearance of United States seamen in the streets intent on forcing order and obedience is especially galling," wrote the New York Times. Although they did get some support, some of the town's residents met the searchers with either silence or vocal opposition. The sailors were grossly insulted in some of the houses they entered, and they were called Republican dogs, scamps, and many other vile things at the time. The sight of armed federal sailors forcing their way room to room, prodding with cutlasses and the butts of their rifles into the bedclothes, lockers, and every possible place a man might be concealed, deterred any assistance to the searchers. For this reason, Lieutenant Carden ensured his men not commit any overt acts while in the dwellings. However, frustrated by local support, Some of the marshals resorted to Cottrell's tactics of obtaining cooperation at gunpoint. With hostilities between the locals and sailors growing, Captain Smith himself was confronted by a crowd and threatened by a man holding a shotgun who said he would blow the head off anyone attempting to enter his home. Captain Smith angrily reminded the crowd that the McLean was there on the authority of the United States government, and he told the man holding the shotgun that his and anyone else's seditious acts would be dealt with, and that they needed to act accordingly lest they wanted to find out. One of the deputies sent to search for Cottrell, S. Lestrange, reported on June 7th to the New York Times that he and Captain Smith were victimized by people who failed them several times in their efforts to capture Cottrell. One particular launch captain named E. Fabre demanded $50 a day for the use of his vessel to make a trip up the Swanee River, when at the time the price of $10 would have been considered outrageously high. And although there were tensions building, President Harrison seems to have had the final say in the matter in his June 6 response to the Senate. He declared that an appeal to the local authorities was impossible in this case, given that the complaint would have been addressed to the very authorities allowing or perpetrating the violence. He wrote, "It will always be agreeable to me if the local authorities, acting upon their own sense of duty, maintain the public order in such a way that the officers of the United States shall have no occasion to appeal for the intervention of the general government. But when this is not done, I shall deem it my duty to use the adequate powers vested in the executive to make it safe and feasible to hold and exercise the offices established by the federal Constitution and the laws." Back in Cedar Key, the landing party had came onto a small bluff where they saw a small boat with about 6 to 7 men pulling away. Lieutenant Carden ordered, "Give them 500 yards elevation." The landing party fired a volley at the boat. It took only 3 well-placed shots to convince 6 of Cottrell's men to surrender, but Cottrell himself escaped up the Swanee River. Captain Smith then ordered Lieutenant Carden and 20 sailors and Deputy Lestrange on an expedition up the Swanee River to search for Cottrell. The plan originally called for the McLean to follow the expedition up the river as far as possible, but Collector Pinkerton became nervous at the prospect of the ship leaving port with Cottrell still on the loose, and threatened that he and all the other custom officers would resign if the McLean left port. So Smith recalled the expedition. Unable to chase Cottrell, Smith sent warnings to him by the easiest means possible. He held great gun practices with his crew, firing blank cartridges from the cutter's howitzers, the low sound of the cannons reverberating through the swamps and up the Swanee River. As the threat of Cottrell's return diminished, the sailors assisted the collector in trying to return to his normal duties. They also protected the witnesses against Cottrell, as well as the town's postmaster, William C. Faraday, who was the only other federal representative in town and had received threats and harassment from Cottrell's supporters. On May 22nd, the Cedar Key Town Council was informed that Cottrell was removed permanently from the town and his office as mayor had been vacated. The council called for a special election on June 23rd. Pinkerton then asked for and received permission to continue the McLean's presence in Cedar Key as long as needed. The cutter left, though, on May 29th, partly because of continuing boiler problems. She returned on June 16th, prior to the election, to ensure Cottrell's faction would not regain a foothold in the town. Smith departed with the McLean, however, on the morning of June 23rd, so no complaint of intimidation could be made by Cottrell supporters. A trial was eventually set for the U.S. District Court in Jacksonville, Florida, but Cottrell would never make the trial. Cottrell had escaped up the Swanee River, slipping into Georgia, and eventually making his way back to his hometown of Hayneville, Alabama, which is located just outside of Montgomery, Alabama. And while he was in Alabama, Cottrell was unable to control himself as usual. The Montgomery Advisor states that he had come to town the previous Wednesday and was drinking heavily throughout the day, and once again proved to be the world's worst dinner guest. He arrived at Dave Fleming's restaurant with a friend named Gus Middleton. Cottrell was being his usual drunk and obnoxious self and ended up cursing and abusing the owner of the rest for no reason. Police officers came and arrested Cottrell and carried him to the police station. He was released though a couple hours later on bond that his friends put up. But as he was leaving the police station, he was very indignant and swore vengeance against the chief of police, Adolph Gerald, and all the officers involved in arresting him. The following morning, Cottrell was still mad as a hornet and stated to several friends that he intended to kill Police Chief Adolph Gerald. Cottrell also sent a letter to Chief Gerald challenging him to a duel. Chief Gerald, however, treated the letter with indifference and even replied by letter to Cottrell saying that he had no interest in dueling with Cottrell, that he had a family to take care of, and that he had nothing against Cottrell. He was just simply doing his job. Chief Gerald's friends, however, were not as relaxed about this and warned him that there would be trouble if and when they met. The next morning, true to his word, Cottrell arrived at Chief Gerald's office at the corner of Perry Street and Madison Avenue. Cottrell pulled up in a horse-drawn buggy, ready to challenge Chief Gerald to a duel. According to the Montgomery Advisor, about 11:30 in the morning, Chief Gerald was standing in front of his office when Cottrell and Gus Middleton drove up and stopped. Cottrell had stepped down from the buggy and had started towards the office door. He was on the edge of the pavement when Chief Gerald opened fire. The first charge took effect in Cottrell's body and he fell when Chief Gerald opened fire. And as he fell, Captain Gerald fired the other barrel, the charge striking Cottrell in the face. Cottrell fell in his tracks and died in a few moments. He did not speak a word after he received the first wound. Newspaper reports that his body was eventually carried back to Haynesville, Alabama, and buried in the cemetery there. I visited the cemetery and was able to find his father and several of his family members, but I could not find his grave. I believe it's here where these trees are growing out of. Today, Cedar Key is a peaceful, sun-soaked Florida town. The Schlemmer house, once riddled with bullets, was later destroyed in a hurricane and rebuilt and is now a quiet little library. Cottrell is barely mentioned in the town's history and even less known by its mostly older tourists and locals. The once lawless streets are now golf cart friendly. But for those who know the story, Cedar Key was once the location for one of the most bizarre and terrifying chapters in Florida's extraordinary history.